I still remember the sharp crack of the gavel echoing in that claustrophobic meeting hall. The sound bounced off polished wood and glass. A gunshot meant just for me. Chlorine from the HOA's prized lakefront pool drifted through the open doors, mingling with stale coffee on the board's table. My hands, calloused from 70 years of working family land, trembled as I unfolded the papers just shoved across to me. Effective immediately, the HOA president announced, his voice smug, his words dripping with finality. The association has exercised its right to sell off the abandoned acreage to settle outstanding community costs. He leaned back in his chair, a 40-year-old man with slicked back hair, expensive cologne, and the kind of grin that only comes from someone who's never shoveled dirt a day in his life. His name was Mark, a man half my age but already twice as arrogant as anyone I'd ever met. My chest tightened as I stared at the document. Black ink sprawled across the page, declaring what I already feared. My 1,500 acres, my blood, my sweat, my family's history, gone. Not sold with my consent, not even bargained for, simply taken. A backroom deal, stamped with the HOA's seal, as if a committee of wealthy neighbors could erase my life's work. "You can't do this," I rasped, my throat dry, my voice cracked from equal parts anger and age. "This land has been mine since before this HOA even existed." Mark's smirk widened. "Then you should have read the bylaws more carefully, old man. We had every right. And besides," he gestured toward the window where sunlight glittered off million-dollar lakefront mansions. "No one wants an overgrown patch of weeds dragging down our property values." A chill crawled up my spine. It wasn't just arrogance. It was entitlement. He didn't see my land as sacred, as something passed down like a heartbeat from one generation to the next. He saw it as collateral, disposable, a nuisance that stood in the way of his empire of perfect lawns and infinity pools. I felt every eye in the room on me. The other board members, neighbors I'd once shared meals with, people who had nodded politely at me for years, but now refused to meet my gaze. Their silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant chirp of cicadas outside. And then, like salt poured straight into a fresh wound, Mark said it. "You've lost, Harold. Accept it. Go home." Go home. Home was gone. My land, 1,500 acres of rolling hills, streams, and trees that had shaded my children and grandchildren, was the only home I'd ever known. And now it had been bartered away, as casually as if it were a used car. I folded the papers slowly, deliberately, because I didn't trust my hands not to slam them back in his face. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. Rage burned hot in my chest, but beneath it, a colder fire sparked, a resolve that made my trembling stop. Because in that moment, staring into the smug face of a 40-year-old who thought power made him untouchable, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. Mark thought he had won. He thought he had buried me beneath his bylaws, drowned me beneath legal jargon. But he had underestimated me. 70 years on this earth teaches a man patience, teaches him the long game. As I walked out of that suffocating boardroom, the late afternoon sun hit my face, warm and golden against the sting of betrayal. I could hear laughter echoing from the lakefront, kids splashing in the water, the clink of glasses from patios where millionaires toasted their empire. All of it was built on arrogance. All of it was built on the belief that I was powerless. They had stolen my land. But what Mark didn't know, what none of them knew, was that buried in those same bylaws he loved to wield like a sword was a loophole, a tiny crack in their fortress of arrogance. And through that crack, I was going to bring the whole thing crashing down. So I ask you this, when the powerful strip a man of everything he's ever loved, what is he willing to do to get it back? The answer, as they were all about to find out, was anything. My name is Harold Whitmore, 70 years old, born and raised in a part of the country where the soil under your boots was as much a part of you as the blood in your veins. I'd spent my entire life working the same 1,500 acres that my father and his father before him had tended. That land wasn't just property, it was history. It was mornings where the mist curled low over the fields, and the dew wet my boots as I checked the fences. It was nights where the cicadas sang and the crickets hummed, and I'd sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the stars blink awake in a sky so wide it made you feel both small and infinite at the same time. It was the smell of fresh-cut hay, the earthy tang of wet soil after a storm, the crackle of autumn leaves underfoot. My grandchildren used to run barefoot through the tall grass, their laughter echoing like music, their little hands clutching wildflowers they thought were treasures. That land was freedom. It was a memory. It was everything. But progress has a way of creeping in like ivy. Slowly at first, then all at once. Developers came sniffing around. Subdivisions rose up on what used to be cornfields. And before long, my land was surrounded by million-dollar mansions with picture-perfect lawns, gated driveways, and neighbors who looked at me like I was a relic that didn't fit into their glossy brochure version of life. That's when the HOA was born. On paper, it was supposed to preserve community standards and maintain property values. In reality, it was a club for the wealthy, a way to control, to dictate, to reshape the land around them into something that fit their vision of perfection. I never wanted any part of it. I didn't ask for their newsletters, their meetings, their rules about fence heights and acceptable paint colors. My home was older than their bylaws, my land older than their neighborhood. However, when the community expanded, they somehow incorporated me into their paperwork. A technicality, they called it, an oversight that I should have sorted out. And at the head of it all was Mark Crawford, 40 years old, sharp suit, sharp tongue, the kind of man who wore sunglasses even on cloudy days, as if the world was too beneath him to look at directly. He had moved in 5 years earlier, buying one of the grandest lakefront homes, with a wraparound porch and a view that stretched for miles. From the moment he arrived, he acted like he owned not just his slice of property, but every inch of land within sight. Mark loved power. You could see it in the way he carried himself, the way his voice rose just a little louder than everyone else's in meetings, the way he cut people off with a smile that said, "You'll thank me later." His first move was small. A letter slipped into my mailbox. "Dear Mr. Whitmore," it read, "your barn, visible from the lakefront, is not up to community standards. We request that you repaint it within 30 days to avoid fines." I laughed when I read it. That barn had stood longer than Mark had been alive. Its red paint had faded into a rustic charm that reminded me of my father, who built it with his own hands. Repaint it? To what? HOA beige? I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the wood stove. But Mark didn't stop there. A week later, another letter arrived. This one is about unauthorized livestock. Apparently, my cattle grazing in the pasture were an eyesore for residents enjoying lakefront views. "Eyesore," he said, as if the lowing of cattle and the gentle sway of their tails under the sun were offensive compared to the gleam of his infinity pool. Neighbors started whispering. Some were sympathetic. I could see it in their eyes, in the way they muttered, "Sorry, Harold," when they passed me in town. But others, the ones who loved their rising property values, sided with Mark. They liked their world polished, controlled, scrubbed free of anything real. The letters turned into fines. The fines turned into threats of liens. Every time I opened my mailbox, there it was. Another neatly folded sheet of paper, Mark's voice bleeding through the ink like poison. At first I ignored them. I'd weathered storms before. Bureaucrats came and went, but the land endured. I figured Mark would grow bored eventually and move on to some other poor soul who had painted his shutters the wrong shade of blue. But Mark wasn't like the others. He wasn't interested in rules for the sake of order. He was interested in rules for the sake of power. One afternoon, I was repairing a section of the fence when I saw him standing by the property line, his arms crossed, his sunglasses reflecting the field. "You know," he said, his voice casual but edged like a knife, "it'd be a lot easier for everyone if you just sold. That land could be worth millions, divided up into lots. You could live comfortably somewhere else. Leave the upkeep to people who fit in." I straightened, gripping the hammer in my hand, my jaw tight. "This land isn't for sale," he smirked. "Everything has a price, Mr. Whitmore. You'll see." That was the first time I felt it, the weight of something bigger than fines and letters. A storm is building on the horizon. And as the weeks rolled on, the storm grew darker. Suddenly, inspectors started showing up, citing me for structural issues in my farmhouse, warning me that my well didn't meet modern standards. Permits I'd never needed before were now required. Every step I took was met with resistance, every inch of my land scrutinized. Neighbors grew quiet when I walked by. Some avoided me altogether. Mark's influence was spreading, weaving through the community like roots that strangled whatever they touched. My daughter, Emily, begged me to fight. "Dad, you can't let him push you around," she said, her eyes flashing with the same fire her mother used to have. She was in her 40s, a school teacher, raising 2 kids of her own. She knew what this land meant. She'd grown up chasing fireflies here, learning to ride her bike down the gravel drive. But even she looked worried when the threats started mentioning foreclosure. And through it all, Mark never lost that smug smile. At every board meeting, he'd sit at the head of the table, tapping his pen, reminding everyone how standards protected their investments. His eyes would flick to me, just for a moment, as if to say, "You're next." I tried to tell myself I could outlast him, but in my gut, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about paint colors or livestock. This was about something far deeper. Mark wanted my land. He wanted control, and he was willing to twist every rule, bend every bylaw to take it. And if I didn't find a way to stop him, 1,500 acres of my family's history would vanish, swallowed by the same arrogance that now stood smiling in a press suit at the head of a boardroom. The storm wasn't just coming, it was here. The weeks after that first showdown with Mark blurred into a haze of letters, notices, and endless threats. Every day my mailbox felt heavier, as if it were weighed down not just with paper, but with the weight of a war I hadn't chosen. The first wave was financial. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines. Lien proceedings will commence within 30 days. HOA reserves the right to seek foreclosure under Section 8, subsection C. Each notice carried Mark's fingerprints. The language was legalistic, but the smug tone behind it was his. At first, I tried to laugh it off. "Let him send his papers," I told my daughter Emily. "Ink can't move mountains." But when I checked my bank one morning, I saw it. Thousands drained in fines automatically levied through the HOA system. They weren't just threatening anymore. They were bleeding me dry. And when I called their office to contest it, I was met with silence. Then a cold female voice. "Mr. Whitmore, the board has already reviewed your violations. You are welcome to attend the next meeting if you wish to appeal." Meetings, that was another battlefield. I showed up, hat in hand but head held high, to their sterile clubhouse with its polished floors and catered sandwiches. Mark sat at the head of the long oak table, his sunglasses perched on the collar of his shirt, his hair slick as always. The other board members, neighbors, doctors, lawyers, CEOs, avoided my eyes. When I stood to speak, Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking like a man watching a show he'd already written. "Mr. Whitmore," he interrupted halfway through my protest about the land, "the community has decided. You're outvoted. Your rustic aesthetic doesn't align with the vision we've established here." Laughter from some, silence from the rest. The humiliation burned hotter than fire, and then came the whispers outside the meetings, at the grocery store, at church. People I'd known for decades wouldn't look at me. Some muttered, "Just sell, Harold. It's not worth it." Others crossed the street entirely. Mark's poison was spreading. One morning I woke to the sound of an engine where there shouldn't be one. Out in the pasture, a drone buzzed low, its camera lens glinting in the sun. It hovered over my cattle, my barns, my house. I could almost hear Mark's voice behind it. "Document everything." I picked up my shotgun, not loaded, just for show, and stepped out on the porch. The drone zipped back toward the mansions, a warning shot across the bow. But the message was clear. I was being watched. A week later, county inspectors showed up. Not one, not two, but 3 of them. They cited me for unsafe fencing, improper waste disposal, and even potential contamination of the nearby lake. All nonsense, all coordinated. Emily shook her head. "He's stacking the deck against you, Dad. He's got the county in his pocket. But I had something he didn't know: patience and records. At night, while cicadas buzzed and the house creaked with the settling of old wood, I sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp burning. Stacks of HOA bylaws, county records, and land deeds surrounded me. I traced my family's ownership back more than a century, signatures in faded ink proving what I'd always known. This land wasn't theirs to touch, but buried in the HOA's charter, I found something else: a clause. Small, overlooked. It stated that in cases of mismanagement or conflict of interest, any HOA member could petition for receivership, effectively stripping the board of power and placing it under court-appointed management. The words burned into my brain. It wasn't a weapon yet, not without proof, but it was a spark. Not everyone had abandoned me. Sam, an old neighbor who still remembered when this place was all farmland, showed up one afternoon with a stack of folders. "Mark's been sloppy," he said, sliding them across my table. Inside were minutes from meetings, some with signatures missing, others altered after the fact. "They're cutting corners, Harold. If you get the right judge, this could matter." Then there was Ruth, the county clerk. She'd grown up 2 towns over, knew my late wife, and remembered family picnics on our land. She leaned across her desk one day, lowering her voice. "Mark's been pushing permits through without proper filing. He's hiding something." She slipped me copies of applications stamped in unusual haste, and Emily, my firebrand daughter, refused to let me fight alone. She started attending board meetings, taking notes, glaring at Mark in a way only a schoolteacher could. "You're not going to break him," she told him once in front of everyone. "You're just showing us who you really are." Mark laughed it off, but I saw the twitch in his jaw. As the pressure mounted, I noticed something. The lakefront mansions Mark bragged about weren't as untouchable as they seemed. Several had liens against them: unpaid dues, contractor disputes, even unpaid taxes. Mark had been so focused on crushing me that he let his own kingdom crack at the edges. And I realized, if they could use the HOA to target me, then maybe I could use the HOA to target them. Legally, the bylaws gave the HOA the power to place liens on properties for unpaid assessments. And once lines stacked up, those properties could be forced into foreclosure and auction. If I could prove mismanagement, get control through receivership, I could redirect that very system. Not out of revenge, but out of justice. To show them that the land they thought was disposable could bury them under its weight. But I won't lie. The war took its toll. Nights stretched into sleepless marathons of worry. I'd sit by the window watching headlights from the lakefront homes flicker across the water, wondering if Mark was sitting on his porch too, plotting his next move. Emily worried about my health. "You're 70, Dad. You can't fight every battle." But I told her the truth. If I lose this land, I lose myself, and I won't hand Mark my soul. By late summer, the harassment had reached a fever pitch. Notices threatened foreclosure. Mark began sending private security to patrol near my property line, men in black uniforms who stood just a little too long on the edge of my fields, arms crossed, daring me to say something. Neighbors who once smiled now looked at me with pity, as if I'd already lost. And then came the letter. Not just a fine, not just a threat, a notice of sale. According to the HOA, my land, my 1,500 acres, had been declared abandoned and sold at a closed auction to recover community losses. I stared at the paper, my vision blurring, my chest pounded. This was it, the illegal act I'd feared, the final betrayal. But as I crumpled the letter in my fist, one thought rang louder than the blood in my ears. They think it's over. They think I'm finished. They don't know what's coming. Because I had the loophole. I had the proof. And soon the boardroom that had humiliated me would become the stage where Mark and his empire crumbled. The notice of sale sat on my kitchen table like a loaded gun. According to the HOA, my 1,500 acres had been abandoned and sold off to a developer. The words bled together in my mind, every letter a knife twisting in my chest. But beneath the pain, a fire burned hotter than it ever had before. They thought they had won, but they had just handed me the proof I needed. For weeks, I worked in silence, gathering every scrap of evidence. Ruth from the clerk's office slipped me more documents, rushed permits, falsified meeting notes, and unsigned financial records. Sam found more discrepancies, money collected from homeowners that had vanished before reaching community accounts. Emily organized it all into binders, color-coded tabs marking every violation, every illegal maneuver. And at the heart of it, the clause I'd uncovered in the bylaws, the right to petition for receivership in cases of mismanagement and conflict of interest. The land sale was illegal, the board had overstepped, and Mark in his arrogance had left fingerprints all over the mess. I filed the petition, quietly, patiently. I didn't tell anyone outside my circle, not even the neighbors who whispered apologies in the grocery store aisles. I wanted the strike to come out of nowhere, like thunder cracking the sky open. When the date came for the emergency hearing, I dressed in my best suit, the same one I'd worn to my wife's funeral. Not because I wanted to look impressive, because I wanted to remember why I was fighting, for her memory, for our children, for every blade of grass on that land. The courthouse smelled of old wood and disinfectant, a place where lives were rebuilt or shattered depending on which way the gavel fell. I walked in with Emily on one side, Sam on the other, both of them carrying stacks of binders that seemed to weigh as much as the truth itself. Mark was already there, lounging in a pressed suit, his lawyer whispering in his ear. When his eyes met mine, he smirked. The same smirk he'd worn the day he declared my land gone. The judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair and eyes sharp as glass, called the case to order. This is Whitmore versus Crawford Homeowners Association, allegations of mismanagement, conflict of interest, and unlawful property sale. Mr. Whitmore, you may present your case. I stood, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. I started with the letters, the endless stream of fines, threats, and notices, each one more outrageous than the last. I described the surveillance, the inspectors, the intimidation. Emily handed up copies, each stamped with the HOA's seal. The judge's brow furrowed as she flipped through them. Then came the financials. Sam laid out discrepancies in the HOA's accounts. Thousands collected, thousands unaccounted for. Payments approved without signatures. Contracts were awarded to companies tied directly to Mark's associates. Finally, Ruth's documents. Building permits rushed through without due process. Approvals stamped within hours instead of weeks, all benefiting developers connected to Mark. And then, the final blow, the notice of sale. I placed it on the judge's desk like a smoking gun. Your Honor, this is the moment they crossed the line. They sold 1,500 acres of private property without my consent. Land that has been in my family for over a century. They called it abandoned. But I live there, I've never left. This was theft, pure and simple. The room fell silent, the weight of my words pressing down like a storm cloud. Mark's lawyer stood, slick and rehearsed. He argued that the HOA had acted within its rights to protect the community, that my property was a blight on rising values, that I had refused to comply with reasonable standards. Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirk plastered on his face. To him, this was just another performance, another chance to show off his power. But when the judge asked about the missing funds, his smirk faltered. When she questioned the rush permits, his lawyer stammered. And when she held up the notice of sale and asked, "On whose authority was this executed?" The silence in the room was deafening. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 70 years pressing on my shoulders. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been silenced, intimidated, or robbed by people who think power gives them the right to take whatever they want. They thought I was too old to fight. They thought I'd roll over. But this land is my life, my family, my freedom, and I will not stand by while they strip it away. For the first time, Mark's sunglasses slipped from his collar and clattered to the floor. His face, always so smug, was pale with something new. Fear. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. This court finds sufficient evidence of gross mismanagement and conflict of interest. Effective immediately, the Crawford Homeowners Association is placed under receivership. The sale of Mr. Whitmore's land is null and void. Furthermore, an investigation into financial misconduct will be referred to the district attorney's office. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in the gallery. Mark's lawyer slumped back in his chair. And Mark just stared at me, his jaw tight, his empire crumbling around him. I didn't smile. Not yet. Justice wasn't about smiles. It was about survival. The following week, a final board meeting was held. Not run by Mark, but by the court-appointed receiver. The room was packed, homeowners buzzing with confusion and fear. I stood at the back watching as the receiver read out the charges: embezzlement, fraud, unauthorized property sales. Mark tried to speak, but every word was drowned out by murmurs of betrayal. The neighbors who once laughed at me now turned their anger on him. "Where's our money, Mark? You lied to us. You sold his land? Without telling us?" The smirk was gone. The sunglasses were gone. All that was left was a man stripped bare, exposed under the weight of truth. I didn't need to say a word. My silence was louder than anything he could muster. Because the man who once told me, "Everything has a price," had just learned the cost of his arrogance. The weeks after the judge's ruling felt surreal, like walking through a dream where the air was finally clean after years of choking smoke. For the first time in months, I could step out onto my porch without seeing a drone hovering overhead, without finding another letter in my mailbox, without wondering how much longer I could hold on. The land was mine again, officially, legally, untouchably mine. Mark didn't go quietly. Men like him rarely do. At first, he strutted into meetings even after the receivership, still trying to bark orders, still trying to remind everyone of his vision. But no one listened anymore. Investigators tore through the HOA's records, uncovering a labyrinth of fraud. Money that should have gone to community upkeep had been siphoned into shell companies. Contracts for landscaping and security traced back to Mark's cousins, friends, and business partners. Every stone they turned over revealed another worm. When the charges were filed, the news spread like wildfire. HOA, president arrested for fraud. His mugshot ran in the local paper, the same smug face now drained of arrogance. He posted bail, of course, but his empire was finished. Neighbors who once hung on his every word now whispered his name with disgust. His mansion, once a symbol of dominance, sat dark and silent, foreclosure papers taped to the door. It wasn't just him either. Several board members resigned in disgrace, their reputations shattered. The HOA, once a weapon wielded against me, was now a carcass under the control of the courts. The receiver, a no-nonsense attorney appointed by the court, began liquidating assets to cover the debts Mark had created. That's when the irony hit with the force of a hammer. The lakefront mansions, the same ones Mark used to sneer about, were subject to liens and unpaid assessments. They were the HOA's property as much as they were anyone's. And so, one by one, they went up for auction. I didn't buy them. I didn't need them. But I attended the sales, standing at the back of the crowded courthouse steps, watching as million-dollar homes were sold to strangers for pennies on the dollar. The very houses that had been Mark's pride and joy were stripped away, just as he'd tried to strip me of my land. Neighbors looked at me differently now. Some are ashamed, some apologetic. A few even came up to shake my hand, stammering out apologies for staying silent while Mark waged war against me. I didn't hate them. Fear makes cowards of many. But I would never forget their silence either. Back on my 1,500 acres, life returned to a rhythm I thought I'd lost forever. The cattle grazed in peace. The barns stood strong, weathered but proud. The air smelled of grass and freedom. One evening, I sat on the porch with Emily, the sun sinking low and painting the sky in hues of fire. She leaned against the railing, sipping iced tea, her eyes soft with relief. "You did it, Dad," she said. "No," I corrected gently, looking out at the fields that stretched into forever. "We did it. You, Sam, Ruth, even the judge." Mark thought he could win by isolating me, but he forgot one thing. Emily raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "That land teaches you patience, teaches you that storms don't last forever. You just hold steady, keep working, and sooner or later, the sun comes back out." She smiled, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I thought about Mark often in those first few months after his downfall. Not out of bitterness that had burned away in the fire of battle, but out of something else, a strange kind of clarity. Men like him believe in shortcuts. They believe in bending rules, in building empires on sand, in silencing anyone who stands in their way. But the truth is simple. Power without integrity crumbles. Always. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't wealthy. I wasn't young. But I had the land, the truth, and the patience of a man who'd worked the same soil for 70 years. That was enough. The land will outlast me. One day it will belong to Emily, then her children, then theirs. The laughter of my grandchildren chasing fireflies will become the laughter of great-grandchildren. The barns may sag, the fences may need mending, but the heart of this place will endure. Mark tried to erase it with a signature, but land like this isn't erased, it remembers. And as I walked the fields one crisp autumn morning, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, I realized something. This fight had never been just about acres. It had been about dignity, about the right to stand on the soil of your ancestors and say, "This is mine. You can't take it." The HOA tried to sell my land, but in the end, it was their mansions that were sold, their empire that crumbled, their arrogance was punished, and me, I kept what mattered. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. When someone tells you you're powerless, when they strip away what's rightfully yours and dare you to fight back, remember that storm's end. Remember that patience is a weapon. Remember that justice, though slow, has teeth. And never ever let anyone tell you that your land, your dignity, your freedom has a price. Because sometimes the only way to beat the powerful is to outlast them.